Please just in a louder voice because it's here.
Why don't you sit here? To begin by telling us what your connection with Vilna is. How are you moving with Vilna?
Okay. First of all, I was born in the Vilna district, in a small shtetl, which is, its daily life was connected with Vilna. Vilna was for us a cultural center, an economical center, and so this is the beginning for me, Vilna. Always when I traveled, I went through Vilna. But my connections with Vilna started during the wartime. I had connections, our underground group in our ghetto, Shvintian, had connections with the underground in Vilna. I personally came to Vilna ghetto from the forest to contact the Jewish underground, actually to negotiate with them about a possibility that either we shall come from the forest into Vilna to join the underground in the preparation for the uprising within the ghetto, or as we proposed, that the underground will give up the idea of the uprising in ghetto and start already in April 1943, when I arrived in ghetto, to send groups of youngsters into the forest to organize a partisan warfare. Then, after the liberation, in 1944, July, I visited Vilna, and finally, when in Israel I started my work as in historical research, I decided that my PhD dissertation was on the Vilna ghetto, and this was my research, and later the book published about Vilna ghetto in flames. In addition to it, for the last years, I again visited Vilna. I was first time invited by the Lithuanian government, Lithuanian Communist government in 1988 to Vilna. It was my first visit in Vilna after I left in 1945. And since then, that time I was a few times in Vilna. Was in the area of the ghetto, and also in the archives, Lithuanian archives, and the Jewish Museum, Jewish Society in Vilna, mainly for collecting of documents.
Go back and ask you more specific questions about each of those things, probably. But just to go back, when you were a child in your hometown, what was your impression of Vilna? How did it seem to you?
My impression, first of all, when I was the first time in Vilna, and it was the first time that I visited Vilna, actually was in 1940. It was a big city, a nice city, a very nice Jewish community. For me, it was also considered a big city, in spite of the fact that I lived before that also a few years in Warsaw, so I could compare. Vilna looked for me more an Yiddish city and an Yiddish center, Jewish center than other places. When I was during wartime in 44, when I was in Vilna, or 43 in the ghetto, of course, was a different impression. It was another situation. When you look on the city from inside the ghetto or from outside the ghetto. And after the liberation, I was again in Vilna in 44 and 45. It looked different. And again, in the 80s, when I was in 88, 89, again, the city changed. It is, for me, Vilna without Jews is not Vilna. Because when I was first time, it looked like a Jewish city. Jewish population was at least 1/3 of the population of the Vilna. And during the war, in 44, 45 when it was a city without Jews. And again, it looked for me a different city.
All right, to go back to, you mentioned you
Vilna Ghetto has, during the Holocaust time, it's a very interesting chapter. Actually, all the problematic, all the story of the Holocaust, you can find within Vilna. Starting with the physical extermination, Vilna was one of the first Jewish centers which faced a physical extermination. Actually, the physical extermination of the Jews started with the German invasion into the Soviet Union. And immediately, Vilna was captured after 2 days after the beginning of the war. The physical extermination was started. Vilna has a unique story during the wartime. Starting for the first days of the war, after the collapse of Poland, and since October 1939, Vilna became under the Lithuanian rule. And actually, during 1939 until the middle of 1940, Vilna was the only city in Eastern Europe where there was still a Jewish flourishing life during the Lithuanian rule, because other parts of Poland were either under Soviet rule, where the whole Jewish life was immediately stopped, and also under the other part of Poland, under German rule, which all the problems of all the Nazi policy against the Jews. So this year, between October 1939 till the summer 1940, Vilna was the center of Jewish activity. It was a center of Jewish refugees from all over Poland, refugees to cross the border, and there was the only place where had a connection with the whole Jewish world. Many of the Jewish leaders of Poland came to Vilna. At that time was Sneh was in Vilna, and Begin was in Vilna, and leaders, religious group, Zionist movement. And from Vilna still there was an immigration to Israel and to other places, with many yeshivot and other groups. This Jewish flourished cultural life stopped in the middle of 1940 when the Soviet occupied entered Vilna, and Lithuania became a Soviet republic. Then in June, end of June 1941, when the Germans attacked Soviet Union, Vilna was captured after 2 days after the beginning of the war. And actually the Vilna Jews was the first big Jewish city which faced total extermination. The Nazi policy of extermination of the Jews started with the invasion of the Soviet Union, and Vilna was, I would say, the first of big Jewish communities which faced this extermination policy. Then, during the Nazi occupation, in Vilna was a ghetto which from 6th of September 1941 till the 23rd of September 43, over 2 years, a ghetto. And inside the ghetto, there was an organized Jewish life. First of all, it was a very strong Jewish Judenrat headed by Gentz, with a clear policy how to preserve, how in the prevailing condition to prolong the time of the existence of the ghetto, hoping that maybe some miracle will happen and the Germans will not have time to exterminate. And Vilna ghetto became a productive ghetto. The policy of the Judenrat was to turn the ghetto into economical unit, productive, that the Germans will need it for economical reasons. Out of about 20,000 Jews in Vilna ghetto, about 14,000 were employed in different places to show that they are productive. Then in Vilna was a very strong Jewish underground. Actually, the first Jewish armed underground in occupied Europe started in Vilna. The call for Jewish armed resistance was on the 1st of January 1942 at the meeting of the Zionist Chalutzim groups, and then was called the famous Abba Kovner's proclamation, "Let's not go like sheep to slaughter." And then the underground was established. Also a unique thing was that in this underground Vilna, all the political youth movements from the left of the Jewish communists till to the right to the Beitar movement, all of them were in one underground organization. In all the other cities, Warsaw underground, Białystok, were separated. This was united in the organization called FPO, Vereinigte Partisanische Organisatie. It's also some uniqueness of Vilna. Then within the underground, the problem of either to plan an uprising in the ghetto or to leave for the forests. In Vilna, were the both alternatives. In Warsaw Ghetto, they didn't have an alternative of going to the forest because there were no forests in the vicinity of Warsaw, and it was clear that the only way to fight is an uprising in ghetto. In Vilna, starting in spring 1943, were all the connection between the underground and the partisan in the forests. I myself was also part of these connections. And there wasn't the two possibilities. And so the dispute shows all the problems of them. Then inside the ghetto, there was a cultural life in the ghetto. There was education, despite the Germans forbidden. There was youngsters were studying, learning. There was a cultural life. There was a theater. It was publications, also some. It was an underground archive. So all this made Vilna some unique among all the other ghettos. And by studying the Vilna ghetto, you can actually, all the problems the Jews faced in the Holocaust, you can find inside the Vilna ghetto. And then also, of course, the liberation stage. Vilna was liberated. The problem was and the few survivors which came back from the forest in Vilna, some of them which came out of hiding, tried to establish a new Jewish life in Vilna, to renew the Jewish community. And then they faced the Soviet policy of not to permit a Jewish national cultural life again. And then from Vilna, I would say, the beginning of the Bricha movement, the illegal chain which went through all Europe, the escape route in the direction of Eretz Israel, of Palestine, that time, like the British called it. It started from Vilna already in 1944. The first underground members, by clandestine ways, escaped from Vilna and reached Poland, Romania, and in the beaches of Israel already in the late 40s. This movement later started in whole Europe, the big Bricha movement called, which hundreds of thousands of Jews were active in this, with the famous story of Exodus, which was one of the peaks of this movement. So Vilna has many of uniqueness in this period, but doubtlessly when you speak about the uniqueness of this period, it is based on the roots of Vilna. It is something Vilna was a unique Jewish community before the war, along the Jewish history. So this uniqueness of the Jewish Vilna community also continued during the wartime.
You mentioned at one point that the Vilna ghetto was one of the few ghettos where few people died of hunger. So I just wanted you to mention that again.
Okay. When you speak about uniqueness inside the Vilna ghetto, I would say that Vilna ghetto, in spite that it was a closed ghetto, and the gates were for Lithuanian and German policemen who checked everyone who was entering or going out of the ghetto. And in spite of the German policy that the hunger was part of the policy, still in Vilna ghetto, because of the social help organized, of the self-help inside the ghetto, I can say that no people died of hunger. There were diseases in Vilna ghetto, but also because of the unique health services erected by the Jews themselves inside Vilna, there was limited epidemics in Vilna. So in this the health problems and social help, Vilna was also unique among the other ghettos.
I'm going to ask you touched on it, but if you could just tell us again in maybe a condensed way about your time in the Vilna ghetto, and just from a perspective of maybe starting with what was it like to be in the forest, and then you're spending a long time there, and then to come in
our connections with the Jewish underground in Vilna Ghetto with FPO started when a group of Jewish policemen from Vilna Ghetto arrived in the ghetto of Święciany. And among them were members of the Jewish underground of the Vilna Ghetto. So through them, it was the beginning of the contact with the Jewish underground. Our idea in the Święciany ghetto was to establish contact with Soviet partisans in the forests and leave the ghetto on the first opportunity when we have such contacts and start a partisan warfare. But the Jewish underground from Vilna, therefore, proposed us to go to Vilna, to reach the Vilna ghetto with our arms that we had, to join the underground and to take part in the uprising. And only after the uprising in Vilna ghetto to try to break through from the ghetto into the forest. And the policy was to try to take with them, during the breakthrough, as many Jews as possible from the ghetto into the forests. For these reasons, I arrived in Vilna ghetto. The problem of arrival in the Vilna ghetto was also complicated. Święciany was about close to 100 kilometers from Vilna. So in April 4th of 1943, the Germans liquidated the ghetto of Święciany, of Ośmiany, and some other ghettos. And the transport of the Święciany Jews to Vilna was carried out by the Jewish police. It was a ruse action by the Germans. Actually, most of the Jews were taken not to Vilna ghetto, not to Kauna ghetto, but were taken to Ponar and Shot. But the story was, and the possibility was that till Vilna, the Jewish police took them by train. So we arrived on the station of Nowe Święciany. I and my friend Shike Gertman from the forest. We were armed, we had with our guns. We contacted a few Jewish policemen, which were the members of underground. We traveled with the train to Vilna. And early in the morning, as when the train arrived into the station of Vilna, immediately we were taken by one of the Jewish policemen, the two of us, in the Vilna ghetto. And in order that then when we shall be led by them, we will not be searched in the entrance because we were armed. And this way we arrived in the Vilna ghetto. After just we left the railway station, all the train was taken to Ponar, and the Jewish police was arrested by the Gestapo, and the Jews were shot in Ponar. This is the famous Kovno train, so-called. But in Vilna ghetto, we met with the leaders of the FPO. I can imagine, that time I didn't know, but the meeting was with Itzhak Wittenberg and with Abba Kovner and some others of them. Again, their proposal was that we shall come to the Vilna ghetto. We said, after being in the forest and after seeing again how the ghetto looked, we said our attitude that if we are planning actually and prolonged warfare, the forest is the best place of it. So out of these negotiations, nothing came out. And I was arrested in Vilna ghetto by the Jewish police. They requested that I will hand over my gun to them. Of course, I didn't have it with me when I was arrested. We were kept a few days in the Jewish prison in the Vilna ghetto. And then, by the interference of the Jewish underground, we were released. And then, after a few days in the Vilna ghetto, on Sunday in the morning, with a group of Jews who went for walk, we left the ghetto. And after this, we left the group. We jumped into one of the courtyards, took off our yellow stars when they had some carrying. And then we went to the Vilna, in the direction of the railway station. We had prepared armbands of the Deutsche Reichsbahn, of people, non-Jews who walked in the railways, German railways, in order to, in this way, to be able to embark a train which goes back to Nowe Święciany, and from there to go by foot into the forest. But it was on Sunday day, and for the feeling leaving the ghetto, with the sadness, with the people full in the streets in the ghetto because the ghetto was smaller. It was still a big population comparing to the size of the ghetto. So to go to the streets of Vilna and see on a Sunday day, yes, my impact when I entered the ghetto, the feeling was that I came from a forest. In forest we felt, it wasn't, okay, okay. My feeling when I entered the Vilna ghetto was an ambivalent feeling. First of all, I came again among Jews. The forest, we were a small group, we were about 25 youngsters. And the life in the forest was also not an easy life. We were all the time hunted by the German police, by Lithuanian police, even by the local population. And so the entrance to the ghetto, and to put on myself again the yellow star, which I wasn't already used to wear it. And then we came very early in the morning, so we were taken to my sister was that time in the Vilna ghetto, and we fall asleep with her. And then when we were awakened by some peculiar noise in the Vilna ghetto, when I went out in the city to ask what happened, then they get the first news that all that the train which I arrived from Shinchane, the people were not left in Vilna, were not taken to Kovna, as was said, but were taken in the closed cattle cars straight to Ponare and shot there. So the first impression was a terrible shock, because I also believe that all the people in the train will be either in Vilna ghetto or in Kovna ghetto. Among them, many of my relatives, my uncles, my cousins. So it was my best friends. Then after this first shock, I would say, that I came across the Vilna, what made me, when I went to the streets of Vilna ghetto, there were full of people in the streets, especially late afternoon, when the people were returned from the work. So, and people were not, the rooms, in one room lived 15, 20 people in one room, or 2 rooms. So people, anytime they could, they were outside, they were in the streets. They're full of the people there. But still it was a life. And so when I left the ghetto, after a few days after being arrested, as I mentioned before, and I went out in the city of Vilna, outside the city. And it was a Sunday. People went to the church with nice clothes. From the apartments, open windows. It was a spring day. I could hear music. And young couples walking on the streets and kissing themselves. It was a different world. When I compared to the ghetto, which I just left a few minutes or an hour before, and outside the city. So this difference was a very striking one. And very interesting, when I spoke with many Gentiles after the war, they say, oh, we suffered in the ghetto during the Nazi occupation. We were Nazi terror, and there was not enough food, and we walked, and we had a lot of suffering. And I told them, look, but when we looked from inside the ghetto, how it's outside, it looked like a paradise. Maybe you suffered, but comparing what we faced, doomed for extermination, doomed for death, without almost any chance to survive. And looking outside the ghetto to outside the walls, it was a different life. So I would say our expectations from the local population at that time were more than today we have a dispute with, let's say, with Gentile. You could help more, you could give more hidings to Jews. The answer was yes, but we alone suffered at that time. But again, when we compared our situation, when we looked from the ghetto outside, it was a paradise comparing to the hell that we lived that time. And our expectations were much more natural, that they will help us more than they helped. Of course, there were righteous Gentiles among the local population. In Vilna, dozens of Jews survived with the help local non-Jews, of Poles, of Lithuanians. And after the war, they became righteous among the nations. We recognized it. But there were only very few. The majority of the people were indifferent to the fate of the Jews inside the ghetto. And there were quite a substantial number of collaborators who collaborated with the Germans. And I can say as a witness and as a historian, without the help of the local population, Germans would be unable to exterminate all the Jews. After all, the forces that they could, police forces that they could put in each place were limited numbers. They were engaged in a war. Most of the Germans were on the front line. But on each German which served in Vilna, there were dozens of local people, mainly Lithuanians, who served in the local police, and they carried out all the atrocities ordered by the Germans and partly by their own initiative. I don't say all of them. They were not even the majority. The majority was indifferent. But at that time, indifference helped the Germans. Jews, in order to survive, needed active help, not a bystander. In order to survive, they needed a local people which will give them hiding, food, forged documents, Aryan documents. So a bystander was actually helping the Germans because the Germans said, look, you don't interfere. We have our policy against the Jews, exterminating, you don't interfere. And part of them helped. So this was the problem of Jewish, let's say, and non-Jewish relations that time. We expected more in order to survive. Without the help of local people, a Jew couldn't survive, except in the partisan in the forests. And this was also another story. In order to survive in the forests, as Jewish partisans, you couldn't act as Jewish partisans in the forests because any partisan movement needs the support of the local population for intelligence, for other purposes. And Jewish partisans, as Jewish groups, didn't find this support to local people. On the contrary. So Jews could survive in the forest only when there were non-Jewish partisans which were ready to accept Jews into their ranks. So again, the problem with the attitude of the local population was also in the forests dependent on the local population.
Can I ask one question? You speak of the Lithuanians, but Vilna